Surviving the loss of a loved one who's died by suicide has its own unique challenges. Learn more about grief in the wake of suicide next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with Dreamlife Psychological Services. For the surviving loved ones, a person's death by suicide often comes as a shock, leaving family members and friends stunned and confused, even if they were aware of their loved one's struggles. And complicating their loss is the stigma surrounding suicide, with many believing that suicide is shameful or sinful, or blaming loss survivors for not having done something. And even some suicide loss survivors blame themselves for not having known or not having done enough. Tonight, we're talking about grief in the wake of suicide, what the journey looks like for survivors, and how we can support suicide loss survivors. So if you have questions about our topic tonight, call them in now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844. or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. My guest tonight is Gina Dixon, the program manager of the Essentia Health St. Mary's Grief Support Services and a suicide loss survivor. Thanks so much, Gina, for coming here tonight. And just before we get started, I do want to let you know that throughout our show, you're going to be seeing emergency 24/7 hotlines to call and to text if you or someone you love and care about is feeling suicidal. And of course, if it's an immediate emergency, call 911. Thank you again so much for coming here. And I introduced you as being a suicide loss survivor, and I think a good place for us to start is for you to tell a little bit about your own story for that.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Carolyn. And I was 10 years old when my father died by suicide. And at the time, obviously, it was a shock for my 10-year-old self. I wasn't aware at that time that he had struggled with depression and addiction. That was something that I became aware of later as an adult. But honestly, part of the piece that was hardest for me as a 10-year-old was just all those secondary losses. Because my mom was the one who found him, she wasn't the same parent as before the trauma of that event. And so just all kinds of routines that we had in our family just weren't sustainable in the wake of her traumatic shock, and also it was necessary to move to a new school, and I was uprooted from some of the friends that I had and the things that were normal for me, and so that it was a perfect storm of difficult things.
And so your entire life changed in a heartbeat.
Absolutely. And my brother was 5 years old at the time. I was 10. And because my mom was given guidance at the time that this was too terrible of a thing to talk about, he didn't attend the funeral, and he really wasn't given any information about what happened to my father, why he wasn't there anymore. And there's a saying by Mr. Rogers, anything that's mentionable is manageable. And unfortunately, because suicide was so unmentionable at that point in time, we weren't able to talk about the good parts of my dad's life too. We weren't able to talk about what a great teacher he was, and the pieces of his life that would have been really helpful to be able to share. But we were all doing the best we could with the tools we had at the time.
Now, I know that one of the questions that people are often faced with, or parents in the situation that you just described in your own situation, is what do I tell my children, and do I tell my children the truth, and do we tell them that their other parent died. Do we tell them how they died? And what's the answer to that?
Well, I really encourage people to talk it through with someone who has some expertise, to do a dry run if they have the opportunity to do that, particularly if they're traumatized themselves. And being able to use language that's age appropriate, it can be really tempting to use euphemisms like gone or sleeping or passed on, and in the long haul, or lost, that can be more frightening to children. And we obviously don't want to share overly graphic trauma content. And so being able to talk about that the person died because they had a brain disease, and their brain wasn't able to help them think straight, using that kind of language reduces some of the stigma of suicide. Obviously, an older teen or child will understand what the word suicide means, but to be able to talk about a completed suicide as opposed to committed suicide, because when we talk about commit, that implies committing a crime, right? And so there are some, we have a free grief support library. There's some really good books written for parents explaining suicide to young children, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel either. There's some help available with that.
I love your advice of talk to an expert on this, because I can't imagine dealing with your own grief and then having to figure out how to say that too. And sometimes we're not even talking about necessarily a parent having lost their spouse. Sometimes it's a grandparent who may have died by suicide, and then the parent has to explain to their own child what happened to their grandparent.
Or it might be a sibling or a family friend. And so being able to talk that through. And the other piece is sometimes in the shock of the moment, or the child might be present and witness things that require immediate explanation or immediate comforting, and we do the best with the resources that we have at the time, and it might be a matter of later circling back and filling in some gaps or explaining things in a new way as we have the words to do so. It's really never too late to revisit something in a new way that can be more helpful.
I think that's really important, because I think a lot of people feel like I need to get it right the first time. And I think also that children take in what they can take in the moment, which the next moment may be, they may be able to take in more information or take in some different information.
Yeah. And sometimes when parents are tempted not to share with their child, they're running the risk that the child might find out through some other source. And that's not optimal, to hear from another peer that maybe doesn't talk about it in such a helpful way. And so that's, in weighing the risks and benefits of talking openly about suicide, that's one of the benefits of building that trust as a parent, that I will always be honest with you, and then also providing supportive resources and just your comforting presence as well.
And I think that's often really actually a big motivator for parents, is that reason alone of, oh yeah, as hard as this is going to be for me to say, I don't want my child to hear this from somebody else.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the many different feelings that people can have in response to a death by suicide.
Well, there's certainly no one roadmap to grief, and so there can be shock, certainly in the beginning, is a very common response. And for others, some people may react with anger or a sense of abandonment of how someone they love could leave them. Guilt, or the woulda, coulda, shouldas, or if only, can be a really natural response. Fear, terror really, of something terrible happening to someone else we love, and just physical effects, stomach aches, headaches, difficulty concentrating, just really feeling like you're going crazy. And I think that can be such a helpful part of grief counseling, is helping people to understand that their trauma responses are natural responses to a really out of the ordinary experience, that their bodies are taking over and trying to protect them. You know, understanding what some of the functions of flashbacks are as a protective mechanism can help us feel less terror about, you know, what's going to be happening in the future.
Let's circle back to guilt, because I think that is often one of the feelings that at least I in my office hear more in relation to a death by suicide than we hear in relation to other kinds of deaths.
Yeah.
And so how do you help, and what are some words that you use when people are so focused on feeling guilty about their loved one's death, or guilty about, I should have known they were in such a bad place, or I should have been able to do something, or it was how can I love somebody so much and not have known this was going to happen?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great question. Well, I would say the first thing that I do is I don't try to talk them out of feeling guilty, because I think people get enough of that already, of being told not to feel something. And so normalizing that is the most natural emotion to have in a circumstance like suicide. And, you know, to be able to process that over time. And I think for most people, as they're able to tell their story over and over again, and consider, you know, the paths not taken, they begin, as they talk with other survivors. I was actually just talking with someone about this today, who said they realized, you know, the path that they didn't take was the path that somebody else had taken, and yet both of their children resulted in the same end of dying by suicide. And so there can be that sense of, you know, what if I didn't force them to go into that treatment program? What if or what if I would have noticed sooner? And so it's often whatever the road is not taken is the natural course that we want to do over. And so allow for people to process that in a way that's helpful for them. And then in time to begin to make some living amends. So if we're feeling like there was something that we really feel that we wish we could have done, is there something in the here and now that honors their loved one in a meaningful way, that's a continuing bond with their child, that's life-affirming and positive, and a way of atoning, really, in a spiritual way that connects out of love rather than self-destruction.
I think that I like what you said about that connecting out of love instead of self-destruction, because I think those thoughts and feelings around guilt and what if I are just haunting thoughts. Yeah. And we want to say to people, like, on the one hand, we understand the feeling, and on the other hand, it still wasn't your fault. To honor the feeling with that.
Yeah. And I would add something too with that, is that sometimes having information about suicide and mental illness and some of the risk factors can help minimize some of the personal responsibility that we might feel for having control over another person versus all kinds of biological and societal stressors that might have contributed to their death as well.
And that's getting back to this notion that depression, which is often linked to people who die by suicide, is a brain disease.
Yes.
This is an illness.
Yeah.
This isn't you didn't try hard enough.
That's right.
This is an illness. There's a really important question here from Nancy from Hoyt Lakes, who said, my son witnessed my other son die by suicide nearly 20 years ago. My son and our family still are grieving and struggling. When will things return to normal?
Oh, that's such a moving question. And it's true that it's not time that heals grief, it's what we do with the time. And we certainly, know of trauma survivors where in order to cope with the horrible pain of what they saw or what they experienced can distract in all kinds of ways. And for some people, that's getting really busy with work. For some people, it's spending too much or drinking too much. But the more we actively avoid remembering and the more we actively avoid talking about what we experience, the more we avoid processing what happened. And so I share with people that it is never too late to do the work. And there are some really effective treatments that are available now that weren't available 20 years ago. And so I would really encourage, if your grief is impacting your ability to function at home or work, it's affecting your relationships, to reconnect with help. And there's no expiration date on working through. And I can say personally for myself, there have been times where I've needed to do a reboot, where some new developmental thing happened in my family. Maybe it was, my children becoming teenagers, and it stirred that old grief up all over again. And I needed to talk some things through with people that had some expertise in understanding what I was going through. And so it doesn't mean that you're failing at grief or doing it wrong if you're needing to reach out for help again.
I think that that's so important. And I mean, coming from you, the director of the grief support program, I mean, that's just an amazing piece of information for all of us to have, which is that can be a lifelong process dealing with our grief, and that it rears its head sometimes at times when it makes sense, but sometimes at times when it doesn't on the surface make sense at all. And so I kind of think when I hear her question about return to normal, I kind of think like, oh yeah, I don't know what that means for her when she's asking that, but that the idea that things are not going to be the same, there will be a difference. I don't know. Some people like the phrase "the new normal." Some people don't like that phrase because nothing feels normal. But it's a new path, at least a different path.
Yeah, I often talk about adjusting and adapting to our lives after our loved ones have died. And so that, the idea that we never, going back to the old normal is just not an option. And having tools, having support in adapting and adjusting, I think is the most hopeful thing that we can do. And for some people that's participating in a support group, and for other people it might involve journaling and processing in a new way.
How do you see stigma affecting people's grief process, the stigma associated with suicide?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Certainly, stigma, whether it's a religious judgment of seeing suicide as a sin, or a judgment of, how could someone do that to their family, that anger and judgment of others towards the person who died. We can feel so defensive of our loved one that we can be angry with them, but it's not okay for other people to judge their pain or judge what they were going through at the time. And so, this idea of survivors being able to share their story, I think, is part of coming through that stigma, and recognizing, my dad was Teacher of the Year, he was well respected, and that anxiety, depression, addiction are equal opportunity illnesses, and by being able to talk about some of those things, I think it helps survivors feel less isolated. And it's really important. This past Saturday, I participated in a Walk Out of the Darkness event, and part of that, they had like Mardi Gras beads, and so the color of beads that you chose represented your connection to as a lost survivor. And it was just really powerful to connect with people, many of whom I had never met before, and see the many ways that suicide affects us individually and as a community, and I think events like that really make a big difference in the healing.
And one of the things I love about these kinds of events is that it shows sometimes our hearts really react visually of seeing that you are not alone, that other people have experienced this. And I think that, you know, with suicide, we have the double whammy. We have the stigma about seeking help. We have the stigma around mental illness, and so I guess it's the triple whammy. And then the stigma around suicide, all of which can be so isolating. And I think what we would say is, please just start talking. You know, we're asking people to do a really hard thing, which is in the worst moments of your life, don't give in to the stigma that isolates you even more then. And don't believe the lies of the stigma.
Exactly. And if the first person that you reach out to doesn't give you the kind of support that you're needing, keep reaching out, because sometimes people who are well-intentioned don't have the skills or the knowledge to provide the right kind of support. And so sometimes people will say, well, it's better not to talk about it, or give some kind of advice that's just not working for you. And trust your gut in that, and keep looking for help that is the right fit.
This is a great segue then in terms of how can we support suicide loss survivors. And I know there's somebody out there who's saying, like, well, what should I say? What are the right things and what are the wrong things? I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I think that's a lot of times of why people don't reach out, is that they're afraid of, like, oh my gosh, I don't want to make it worse.
Yeah. Well, first of all, if we spend more of our attention listening rather than speaking, we're less likely to make those kind of errors. And so I think that's really a key of not jumping in with the intention of fixing someone's pain or giving them advice about their pain, but really seeking to understand what their grief looks like, goes a long ways to showing respect, and also to treat people like survivors, not like victims. Most of us don't like being treated with pity, and while that can be well-intentioned, I think being able to recognize someone's resilience and courage in living daily with the challenges of being a survivor is worth our respect. And so that would be another piece. To be able to offer practical help of, would it be helpful for me to run some errands? Would it be helpful for me to carpool with the kids to, you know, free up some time if you'd like to go to a support group, or, you know, connect people with resources? And if we are a family survivor ourselves, I think to be careful not to overwhelm someone with trauma details of our story. Probably the last thing they need is more trauma content in their life. And it's okay to identify ourselves as a survivor, but be careful about not re-traumatizing someone with a whole lot of details that just might overwhelm them further.
I think where you said the idea of listen more, talk less, is such a key. And so a lot of times I think if I was a new suicide loss survivor and then I asked you, can you tell me what your experience is, then that's an invitation, right? If we wait for the invitation, then that is the giving of permission. Or even, I guess we could say, like, I could tell you what it was like for me. Is that something that would be helpful for you to hear right now?
Yeah, and to talk about what was helpful for us as opposed to the trauma details of the story.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because that's processing our own trauma rather than really with the intention of helping someone. And sometimes we just get into trauma mode. Someone was just sharing in a situation with me this week where they lost their voice.
I'm going to cut you off here
Sure.
because we only have 2 minutes left, and I want you to tell us a little bit about the resources that are available at St. Mary's, because they come at my favorite price, and we have a graphic up, and the price of all of your resources is
all of our support groups are free, and our library and all of our printed resources are free. So we have a family members suicide survivors group. We have a young widow and widowers group. There are groups specific for teens and children 6 to 12. We have a group for senior widowed people and for bereaved parents. And if you're not sure which group you fit into, just call and we can talk it through. And speaking of confusion about where I fit, more and more we see family members who have had a loved one die by overdose, and there's some confusion of whether it's accidental or not.
And unfortunately, I have to cut her off here, and this is like causing me pain. So what she was just saying, with all of the terrible drug overdoses that we have, is sometimes we don't know, did the person mean it or did they not mean it? And that ambiguous loss, learning to live with that ambiguity and not knowing, is so, so hard. Now, a lot of you called in some questions about suicide and not suicide loss. I'm going to answer them in a blog. We'll post the blog on the website, which is wdse.org/speak, where you can rewatch this episode, look up old episodes, and just binge watch all 148 episodes from our 8 seasons plus on the air. Join us again next week when we'll be talking about making peace with our bodies. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.